So to introduce our two fantastic speakers, first we've got Jim, who I can now see with what looks like new glasses. So Jim, welcome, not new glasses, old glasses, just haven't seen you in a while. Jim was actually our first speaker at the first webinar that we had at the start of COVID, where I think we had 15 people. So how that has grown. I don't think Jim really needs any introductions. Wonkhe specialist, student union specialist, all around provocateur sometimes, who says what everyone wishes they had the balls to say, so to speak. So Jim, welcome. Also really excited to welcome Hannah. We thought getting the student voice today is also super important given what is going on. So really excited to welcome Hannah. Hannah came into the student movement in 2010 and has never left. Joined the NUS as HE policy officer in 2017, has run student-led access and participation at Cambridge Student Union, and is leading the NUS's cost of living strategy. We're not in crisis, if someone can remind me when that is. She's interested in democracy, redistributing the power of education, and believes that teenagers will save the world, something I would love to discuss over a cup of coffee or a very strong whiskey. I'm going to shut up. I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to start, and then Jim will take over after her, and then we will go to a Q&A. So with no further ado, Hannah, the screen is all yours. If anyone has any questions to ask, please pop them into the chat and we'll make sure that we get to them. Hannah, over to you.
Right, thank you for that. What a rip-roaring introduction. Let me just get my screen up. There we go. Can everyone see the front of these Google Slides? Somebody give me a nod.
Yes,
yeah.
All good.
Great. Audio and visual nods. So welcome everyone. So nice to see so many people on the call and some familiar faces from SU Advice Services. I'm Hannah, you're more than welcome to call me Sketch. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Campaigns and Influencing Manager at NUS UK. So I am shepherding some of our work on the cost of living crisis. What I'm going to do today is talk to you a bit about our research, share some of the key findings from that, and then obviously share some recommendations and take any questions that you've all got. I think I've got about 10 minutes, so just like wave frantically at me when you want me to stop, and let me kick off. So I'll first talk to you very briefly about what NUS is. We are the national body that represents the 4.5 million or so students in the UK across higher and further education through their students' unions, of almost all of whom are members of our organisation. So those students' unions elect officers, but they also employ staff members like me to keep things going in the kind of civil servant role. So that's the little organisational intro. Let me talk to you about our research. So in about June, when people started to talk about this, cost of things going up, maybe we're going to have a cost of living crisis, we chucked some research out into the field. We got just under 3,500 respondents, and of those, about half received the standard higher education student finance package. That's not because there's like some mega crisis, that's because we had quite a lot of international student respondents, and quite a lot of apprentices and FE students respond as well, so they are on a different support package. Now, already in June, 3/4 of them believed that there was a current cost of living crisis, and I'll tell you right now, we've got this survey in the field again. We've already got more respondents than we did for the month of June, and I could only see this number going up. So let me deep dive into some of the kind of more interesting findings. I think the first thing to say is that students' confidence in their loan power is absolutely diminishing. So you can see here this very shiny bright yellow for very confident, like very, very few students are confident or extremely confident that their loan is going to cover their energy bills. Again, I can only predict that that will go down this year, like in this second round of the survey. Very few confident in covering the cost of living comfortably. Transport, the weekly shop and educational materials, like all of these basics that, you know, we're not even asking them about going out here. We're just talking to them about the basic costs needed to live their lives. And I think that's quite interesting because for a long time in NUS, we've been saying that the maintenance loan needs to become a maintenance grant, and that needs to be tagged to the level of the living wage. And I think it really shows here that even in June, where we were comparatively economically better off, students' confidence in their loan power was absolutely falling through the floor. So this is a bit of a spoiler alert for the poll in the at the start there, but we asked students to rank from 1 to 5 what their most pressing financial pressure was on them at that moment. Unsurprisingly, the cost of housing. So we asked them for the cost of housing as like a wraparound cost, including energy, water bills, because for a lot of our members, as I'm sure most of you will know, they'll be on housing contracts that include bills, many of which landlords are currently unscrupulously trying to change. And a lot of them were ranking housing as their number one financial pressure, closely followed by energy and travel here. And something that we found was that the cost of travel was particularly a concern for those students who had dependents and those students who were doing placements. So we put a call out for students to kind of just tell us their stories about the cost of living crisis at the same time. We're now at over 1,500 responses. So if you'd like some of those stories for your own campus and the Students' Union on your campus is a member of NUS, then you are more than welcome to have them anonymously. But something that was coming through really strongly there is that students were like physically really worried about being able to travel to campus, travel to their placements, get their kids around. Something really interesting here is about the support sources that students are going to. So you'd kind of expect, so the green and the pink here, the top line and the bottom line for each bar graph is where we've asked this question before, because we basically once a quarter put out a mass survey on, you know, what's it like to be a student right now? Where are you seeking financial support from? And you can see people seeking financial assistance from any fund has gone up. You know, it's kind of, if you think about the, you know, what the media thinks is a traditional student, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, two-parent family, giving them some support from home, like a semi-detached house in the countryside to go back to. Those top results kind of unsurprising, right? But what I'm particularly interested in is this really quite big increase in the amount of people who are seeking loans rather than just some support from their family or from their friends or from the bank. But also the quite sharp increase here in the use of credit cards, in the use of things like Klarna. I'm sure lots of you have seen. Yesterday, I think it came out that Deliveroo has started saying that you can use Klarna as a way to pay. And so the amount of students seeking support from those like slightly more unstable sources and kind of credit schemes that are in the control of other agents. But I'm really interested in the use of hardship funds here. So, and I imagine there's some light that people on this call could shed on this one, because to me it seems like the people who were talking to us and the people who were sharing their stories should absolutely be right at the top of the queue for accessing institutional hardship funds, but the numbers are comparatively low. And they've always been quite low, right, if you compare January and June. So I'm really interested in what's going on there, and I'm really interested to see if that number shoots up in when we get the next set of results back. Because my hypothesis is that it's very much received wisdom in the student community that hardship funds are very difficult to access, and that's very often borne out in truth, right? The process can be quite invasive. It can be perceived to take a long time. And if you're an international student, you might just think, well, it's not for me. And so I'm interested in what we can do about that as students' unions, as advisors, kind of as an education sector. And there's some work that we want to do in partnership with the wider education sector on that. So that's something that's that's interesting there to pull out. And then obviously something that's really interesting is behaviour change. So obviously you can all see that we asked people what they were cutting back on in light of the cost of living crisis. And the top thing was, as you can see, by far and away, socialising. And I think it's really important to remember here that when, like, the people who were talking to us were international students, student parents, lots of apprentices, lots of FE students. So they weren't the people who would traditionally think, I'm cutting back on socialising, so I'm going to have 2 fewer pints in an SU bar, right? For them, I think socialising has quite a different conception. And I think especially coming out of 2 years of a pandemic, another exceptional circumstance, as Vivi flagged, it's quite alarming that this is understandably the first thing to go, because we're already in a wave of student loneliness, right? And this is only going to compound that. Interestingly, so if you think back to what I said about the cost of travel, and about how, you know, parents are saying to us that they're worried about running their kids around, student parents were cutting back on all of these behaviours except transport. And the reason coming through in the qualitative data for that was because they want to run their kids around. They don't want their kids to miss out on clubs and birthday parties and after school activities, and obviously childcare. So something interesting there. And so those are the kind of key stats that I've pulled out. There is an absolute wealth of data which I will drop in the chat box, but, you know, bearing in mind the kind of short amount of time to go through this, I wanted to also spend some time touching on our asks. So you may or may not have seen yesterday that the government announced that the budget has been moved from where we were all kind of thought it might be at the end of November to October the 31st. Incredible timing for campaigning organisations, I say. Never make a major political announcement on a day that already has a very clear theme. So we've got a Halloween budget coming up, but in that budget or autumn statement, we're asking for a student support package. So emergency financial relief, as we saw, provided in Northern Ireland over COVID. So there, every student got a flat £500 payment. We're asking for that across the UK. We're asking for maintenance loans to be raised in line with inflation. So they've gone up 2.3% while inflation is spiralling. We're asking for thresholds of eligibility for maintenance loans to be readjusted to reflect the cost of living. So to reflect the fact that if your parents have a combined income of £60,000, that's worth significantly less now than it was this time last year. And then longer term, so through the next general election, however soon that will be, hopefully quite soon from our perspective, we're asking for commitment to bring back maintenance grants. We're asking for longer term commitments to the apprentice living wage. And then we're also asking for action on transport costs and rent controls. Now, those both also combine with our kind of more local facing asks, which I think people here will be quite interested in discussing, and I'm happy to go into lots more detail. So action on transport, obviously very locally delivered by local authorities, by metro mayors, by combined local councils, by, you know, all of those strange, like, devolved bits of power that we find across kind of the parts of England and the nations of the UK. So we're asking for action on transport. We've actually seen some students' unions start to run their own bus routes from student areas onto campus, which I think is a fantastic, quick bit of action there, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. We're asking them to cap rents in student accommodation, to put in rent controls, with the strategy behind that being that where universities tend to be like the major landlord in a student town, where the university takes action to control its rent, that has an impact on the rental market as a whole. We're asking all decision makers and influential figures in unions and colleges to join us in Westminster lobbying. I think it's really clear here that we're not taking the attitude of it's students versus their unis versus their colleges. We're all being affected by this. We're an education sector as a whole, and we all need to point towards government. But most crucially, we're asking to ensure that hardship funds are accessible, and we're going to do some work around sharing practice between students' unions, between different providers to come up with a real clear and quick set of recommendations to make that happen.
Hannah, I'm sorry, we'd like to circle back and discuss hardship more, but Jim's just gotten a message. He has to leave us in 7 minutes. So if nobody minds, what we're going to do is, perfect timing, but I do want to get back to the hardship because we've got questions about that. But what I'm going to do is ask Jim to jump on, talk really quickly, and then you and I will circle back and answer the questions. Is that all right?
Absolutely ideal. Let me check on those links in the chat and start sharing.
Let's do it. So Jim, if you want to talk super fast, Jim's been called away. So Jim, if you want to jump on, talk super fast, and then once you head out, then Hannah and I will carry on from there. So Jim Dickinson, over to you.
Great to be here. One of the things that I think, certainly I've been thinking about on trains over the past couple of weeks is what the current crisis says about where we are on student finance, and therefore what we ought to be thinking about as and when the crisis passes. Now, hopefully, fingers crossed, the crisis will pass. There will be a period where we're no longer thinking about the very poorest dropping out, people not being able to afford their bills in significant numbers, and so on and so on. And maybe that is a silly thing to do, and maybe we ought to prepare for a kind of very, very long and bitter crisis. But nevertheless, I have been thinking about the mess we're in, if you like, and what the crisis kind of reveals about that mess. Now, there's a couple of things about this thing. On the income side, it seems to me that wherever you are in the UK, we have become horribly muddled about who is a student attending or at least enrolling into higher education. We have this mixture of parents and grandparents and savings, this idea that there ought to be a chunk of money behind you on enrolment. That's certainly, that's a deep underpinning of the assumption around international students. There's the state, and when I say the state, I do mean both the country you happen to be in and the Department for Education's budget. Then there's the kind of welfare budget of the kind of main part of the Westminster state, which isn't devolved. And then to some extent, we're also thinking about local authorities and the role that they play in bailing people out or funding people through difficult times. Then there's this question about loans and the extent to which we ought to loan people money and then expect the full amount of that loan to be paid back. And then there's both part-time work, the extent to which students ought to be able to kind of work, and then student financial support from universities. And it seems to me that one of the really difficult problems we've got is that most of those bits, most of the people running each of those slices of responsibility agree that students aren't having a great time and do need money, but like a really expanded and complicated version of that Spider-Man meme, there's about 9 people that are all pointing at each other, arguing that other bits of the state or the quasi-state or the sector ought to be doing more for students. And it does seem to me that we, in each part of the UK, need a fresh settlement that properly clarifies the respective responsibilities of each of those people. Second thing that I would say is that it's also clear, I think, talking to lots of people around the country, once you go broader than the kind of student financial support and student financial advice question, that one of the deep problems we have in higher education is that it remains the case that there is not a settled view on what it means to be a full-time student. And I mean that both generally and specifically. Generally, I mean, we don't have a very good understanding of what students are doing with their lives beyond the occasional hours that they turn up for student contact. But then very specifically, there isn't a settled view across the sector, either at kind of the chalk face level or even the kind of strategic level, on the number of hours it's reasonable for students to be working part-time, the nature of that work, the quality of that work, and the pattern of that work. And unless we are able to establish a pretty clear kind of sense of what it is that students ought to be doing with the other hours of their week, we're going to continue to struggle to deliver a vision that says this is the amount of money they need to support themselves when they are neither able to engage in part-time work nor able to nor able to do other things because they're supposed to be studying. But back to the kind of actual crisis briefly. You sent me a list of questions, Viv, and I've got some pretty sharp answers to them. And a lot of them really focus on what it is that people need to know. So there's a few questions in there about what international students considering studying in the UK need to know, and what people generally might be thinking about in terms of need to know. And one of the things that I'd say about all of that is, I think people may well have seen a piece I wrote for the site a few months ago that surveyed in August the cost of living information that was being put out by universities about this academic year. And frankly, with a couple of very rare, very minor exceptions, the quality of that cost of living information was absolutely shocking. It was incomplete, out of date, completely failed to warn international students in particular about inflation and the inadequacy of the Home Office's amount of money that people need to get into the country figure, which has only gone up by 1%. And I guess what I would say about that is I can make a decent argument that universities, not as kind of sales bodies for their own degree courses, but as providers of information, advice and guidance, have a special responsibility either to collaborate or individually provide really, really good information on how much it costs to be a student, because all of the research tells us that students, regardless of whether they are home students or international students, tend to underestimate the amount of money that they will need to live on and study and to get the most out of student life, rather than overestimate. The other question that I was going to respond to before I have to kind of rush away was this question about dropout and non-continuation. Clearly, because of the way that the Office for Students in England in particular, but also to some extent Scottish outcome agreements and other parts of the sector worry about dropout, there is this sense that once you're on a degree course, dropping out is a problem, dropping out would be a failure, dropping out must be prevented, and there's lots of pressure on universities, both directly and indirectly, to reduce dropout. And I think what I would say is it reaches a point, and student finance matters reach a point, wise, I think, to be trying to persuade a student to hang on in there rather than find a way to step off. Now, I'd say two things about that. One, I think it's incredibly important that everyone involved in student finance advice work familiarises fully with all of the ways in which a student is able to step off or pause and attempts to influence the ways in which an institution is able to kind of smooth that process or ease that process. But secondly, I would say that it's important for the sector to be lobbying government to make it more possible for a student to pause or step off, partly in pursuit of lifelong learning, but very specifically because it seems to me that the student hardship crisis will get so bad this winter that asking a student to hang on in there is really guaranteeing that they won't get out of higher education what they ought to be getting out of it, and it's probably very much in their interests to pause rather than to continue to pay the tuition fee check and to hang on in there, as people say, in order to not damage the university's dropout stats. So there we go.
Jim, thank you so much. As always, far too much food for thought for us to let you go so easily, but we know you have other things to do. I'll message you later and maybe we'll get some Q&A on a video that we can then send to everybody. But thank you so much for being here, and as always, lobbing a few hand grenades in, which is always helpful, I think, for people to think about. Have a good day, look after yourself. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for understanding, I guess, these things happen. So I guess we'll open it up to questions. Obviously Jim isn't here to answer some of his questions, but we are going to note them down, and I will bully him later into answering them on camera, and then we'll send it over. But Hannah, you also presented some disturbing and worrying statistics there, and I guess I'm curious from your side. There's obviously the asks, some of which are big policy questions, and some of which need to be handled at a policy level. But I'm curious to know, while people are submitting their questions, what you think universities can do in their own capacity, recognizing that they don't have unlimited funding, obviously, unfortunately, what you think universities can do at the high level, at the granular level, to support students as we go through some of these issues with, you know, rent going up and with energy going up, that universities unfortunately don't have the power to address, you know, themselves. So I'd love your thoughts on that. And if you've got any questions, guys, please do pop them in the chat. We do have some pre-submitted ones, which we'll also go through. Hannah, what are your thoughts?
So I think I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of because there's such a feeling around the cost of living crisis of do something, do anything, do it now. And we get that from, you know, member unions, we see it from universities, we see it, you know, from some parts of the government, but also not at all from others. So, but I think it's really important for every actor in this scenario to think about doing, like what we've been saying to our members is, do the one thing that only you can do. And I think everyone's got to hold that, right? So, you know, give good money advice. What is it that only universities can do? They can create community for their students. They can provide space. They can provide staff time. They can, and they can provide hardship funding. They can talk about, they can make that more accessible to students. They can, you know, take down some of the barriers to accessing those pots of funding without necessarily having to delve deeper into new pots. But I think it's also really important to talk about what people can't and shouldn't do. I think, which is maybe the grenade of my own here, but you know, lots of people are talking about, you know, I'm going to set up my own food bank, I'm going to do a community kitchen. And it's like, you could do that, but also if you run the catering on your campus, take action on that. Like, that's a lever that you own, that you can pull yourselves. You know, we're seeing lots of really good work around setting up, like in SU owned catering outlets. You know, York, for example, has started doing 40p beans on toast. Like, just real small things that you can do with the levers that you own to pull, rather than going all the way over here and going, I've got to set up a community pantry. And you know, there's a role for that, of course there is, and there's, you know, especially a role in creating that community space, but you've got to be really clear on why you're doing it, I think. So yeah, so that was a bit of a ramble, but it's
no, not
anything you can do.
No, not at all. And I think Jim published in Wonkhe a 101 ways to help bring the cost of living down on campus, which I've just popped into the chat for anyone that didn't see this on Wonkhe, I think a couple of weeks ago. Hannah, you touched on hardship funding, and there's actually a question from Julie, who's asking, in what ways have students said that hardship funds are not accessible enough? Are you talking about how to apply for them, the complexity of the forms? What is it that you mean, so that the people around the room who are administering or designing those funds can bear that in mind while they're putting them together?
So what I'm actually on my other screen, I'm just bringing up our bank of case studies so I can do a quick get some students talking in their own words. But as a general theme, what we get is, I don't think the hardship fund is for me, and if it is for me, I don't think I'll get it. And so it's not that there's sometimes, of course, there's a process design. You know, I'm really struck by a student who told me they were turned down for hardship funding in April because in January they bought some new jeans, and so they've been judged to be financially irresponsible. But that's quite an extreme example, right? I think there's a real job to be done around communicating hardship funding, but also communicating what's happening now within the student body economically is that a whole very large cohort of students who are normally economically quite well off because they have savings and, you know, grandparent, and, you know, they have all of that like comfortable trappings of middle class life, right, are now suddenly in hardship because of the huge waves this is causing in society. But there's also a cohort of students who have probably always been in hardship and don't consider themselves to be. And so there's kind of a two-pronged comms approach there to be taken. But let me do I can take another question while I just do a quick search for some.
You're looking for some stats for us, because we do love some good stats. And I think one of the things we're increasingly anxious about at Blackbullion is that the bank of mum and dad, the trappings of middle class, as you put it, the bank of mum and dad is getting tapped out. And so the proportion of students who are requiring support is increasing as we move along that bell curve of financial support. So we've always had a portion of students who've had financial difficulty and who've needed support. But as we move down and you know, we're starting to see people in, you know, in paid work who are using food banks, and we're starting to see people who are using, you know, payday lending. And as you said, Klarna, if you're using Klarna for Deliveroo, people don't be ordering your Deliveroo. But we are seeing that bell curve, the line on that bell curve starting to shift into families that are middle class and would have under normal circumstances had a little bit more income. So is there, and we know that a lot of students are uncomfortable speaking to their parents because they believe that their parents are also in financial difficulty, which puts students between a rock and a hard place because they don't have the money, but they also don't want to be hassling their parents to ask for it. Is there anything that we as professionals in the sector who are helping students can give them the confidence to ask for help? Because my concern is that students won't ask parents, will rather just not eat because they're too worried. Is there something that we can be doing? Is there language we can be using? Are there places we can be directing students to?
So I think for me, it's about working hand in hand with students' unions and joining up all parts of the students' union, where we've got colleagues who are advisors situated in their union or advisors situated in their uni. But again, it's coming back to, you know, what are the one things we can do as unions, as people who do student engagement. We can take people up a hierarchy of needs. So when they interact with us and say, I've got 75p in my bank account, what am I doing? We can take them from, okay, well, here's the support that you need, but also here's how to advocate for yourself. And I think it's not, for me, it's not about certain language. I mean, I'm sure there is certain language out there, of course, but that's not something that I've got, unfortunately. It's about those conversations and how we join up work across institutions. I've got a hardship fund example, if I can drop back onto that.
Of course, go ahead. And then Danny, will come to you in a second. I see your hand, don't worry. Go ahead, Hannah.
So this is a story that we had in from a PhD student at a university in the West Midlands who said, PhD students come from all stages in life. I have PhD friends who have mortgages to pay and kids to feed, but the cost of living crisis is nothing new for them, only that it's gone from bad to worse. Like many unis, my uni has a financial hardship fund, but this, as with everything, is designed almost exclusively for undergraduates. Research students are are apparently often rejected by this fund because they have a regular income, even though the income is, as mentioned, barely minimum wage and often well below what's actually needed to support your living costs. It's reminiscent of the notion of in-work poverty. It's not enough to live on, but not so little that you're actually eligible for emergency support. As with all such funds, the application process is mentally and emotionally draining. You have to basically bare your soul to the uni, and it really puts me off from even applying. And I think there's that real comms job to do, isn't it? To say, you know, whether you're an undergrad, like, it's not undergraduate by default, it's student by default.
I think that that's a really interesting point. I do think there's a couple of different components, because the one is, how much is the university okay to ask, given that there is limited funding, and how much is that it's not being communicated whether or not you can apply, whether people are feeling like they should. Danny, I want to bring you in also, because you had your lovely little hand up. Danny's at Staffordshire as part of the union, so you know, I'd love your thoughts on you know, on what we're talking about. So please go ahead. And we'll get to a couple of questions. Not ignoring the questions. We're going to get to them. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Vivi, and cheers for joining us, Sketch. I think I just wanted to jump in on lots of those points that Sketch has just made around working with your students' union. So as Vivi said, I'm Danny, I'm the advice manager at Staffordshire University Students' Union. I'm really lucky to have a really good relationship with lots of colleagues in our university. I know that Kim from our brilliant money and guidance team is on the call today. I met with Kim's manager last week talking about how we can work together with the university's support teams and our support teams around cost of living and lots of other things. There are, I suppose, there's things that we can do in students' unions that perhaps university colleagues can't always get away with. You know, Sketch has been talking a lot in terms of the campaigning work that we're doing, the lobbying as part of NUS, but kind of locally as well, with local councils and different places. So there's things that maybe your students' unions, for university colleagues, there's things that your students' unions are better placed to deliver than you are in some instances. But I think that whole institution approach that involves your students' unions is really, really important. Like I said, there's lots of things that we can do that maybe necessarily you can't always get away with, and there are things that you do that we just can't provide, and so whatever you can do to bring your unions into those conversations, to have like a genuine whole university approach, I think is really important. I know not all unions have great relationships with their universities and vice versa, but I think this is an issue on which we can all kind of join up. We are all seeing the impact on our students. I was just running the stats as Jim was talking as well. I run a food bank. We've had a food bank at Staffs for a number of years. We run in our students' union, and I've done 36 food referrals so far this year. I think I've done 22 the same period last year. We had something like 150 for the entirety of the last academic year. So things are getting really challenging, which we all know anyway, but whatever you can do to work with your students' unions, please get in touch with them, because this is something that I think we can all unite on.
Thanks, Danny. And we would certainly echo that. Whole institution approaches are actually the only approaches that really work, certainly in a crisis. The gaps between services can be so big that a lot gets lost in the middle of them. I just want to get to a few of the questions and the points. Matt Daly, two-time uni battle champion, says, see how I got that in there, Matt. I got that in there. That they are working, and Matt is at Reading. We're working with our SU on myth busting for applying to our student hardship fund, which we hope will help with some perceived barriers from a student's point of view. Hannah nodding very, very hard there. So we're giving that one a 2 thumbs up. Thank you. Phil is asking, do you advocate, and Hannah, this I guess would be for you, or Sketch, as I'm now going to call you, because apparently that's the cooler name. Do you advocate the NUS to signpost students to university hardship funds? It's the question Phil is asking.
I mean, in terms of our national work, yeah, of course. I mean, we don't, so I suppose just some more clarity on the way that we work. We, as a national body, don't take on individual casework because there's a call full of all of you who have the site-specific expertise to do that. But what we do is the national lobbying and the campaigning on behalf of students. So where we do get in students who say, you know, this is going on for me, what do I do? We always, first point of contact, redirect them back to their Students' Union Advice Service, and from there on to hardship funds or whichever support services that they need.
Couldn't find my unmute button. Thank you very much for that. Emma is asking, and I have a feeling I know the answer to this, can we encourage the government to move to a model like Wales, where all students are off to the same start in terms of the amount of maintenance funding, so don't have the pressure of parents plugging or not the maintenance assessment gap? Hannah, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on what that answer might be.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So the Wales model is sort of best described as 2 sliding scales. So everyone starts from the same place with a lump of maintenance funding, and then depending on your parental income, either your own contribution goes up or the government's contribution goes up. Imagine that, a good solid government contribution to the cost of education and to the cost of maintenance. And interestingly, so where we asked students, like where we did this open case study call, we asked them, you know, tell us about the impact on you in your own words, but also tell us what needs to be done. And a fair few students said, well, Wales looks quite good. So yeah, I think we will certainly be advocating for elements of that system to come across the border in general election manifestos.
Yeah. And here's hoping that the lobbying works. The Matt Damon Mars movie comes to mind, where I suspect that the message for us all at the moment is, what if no help was coming? What can we do? Because just watching what's happening in the markets at the moment, and the Bank of England rescue packages for pension funds, I have a feeling that getting hands on large swathes of money, which is what would be required given the volume of students that we have in this country, I think we advocate, we do what we can, and Sketch, you know that you can rely on us to back you up in any way that we can. I think if we assume that no help is coming, I think that's probably the more likely scenario, unfortunately, especially over the coming few months. Claire making the point, agreeing about working better with own SUs, and if anyone's got thoughts or can share any ideas of how they are working with their SU, please pop it in the chat, and when we send out the wash up afterwards, we'll include as many points of sharing. Part of the point of these webinars is to get lots of great brains in the room in order to share ideas. So please do pop them in. Susie asking, any ideas on sharing food bank promotions? We offer referrals, but often due to negative associations, many students don't feel comfortable accepting the support, something we're hearing a lot. Danny, do you maybe, although you're not formally a speaker, but I feel like you're comfortable taking that one, given what you just said. Do you want to give some thoughts on that particular question? And Sketch, obviously jump in if you've got any other thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I'm a big I've got a lot to say about food banks or food hubs or whatever they might be locally. I think we do see an issue with stigma, particularly with mature students, a lot of the time. And so the number of family bags, as an example, that we give out, or family referrals, is a lot fewer to those who don't actually have dependents. What I'd say, though, is there are different approaches to take. So the one that I'm taking currently as staff is I don't provide food. Aldi have got a scheme where they provide orange vouchers, which are ones that you can't use to buy alcohol or lottery tickets. For me, that isn't an issue, but for our funders, that's something that they've preferred, which means a student then has got 15 quid or 30 quid if they've got dependents to go and do a shop in Aldi themselves, rather than giving them tins of food and things. There are other options for those of you who run on-campus commercial operations, whether that's shops with your students' union or independently, whether there's vouchers that you can give for someone to go and get things from your shops. So there's different options that work. My preference is not to hand out physical food unless we need to, but that voucher system gives students the ability to go and buy what they need and what they want and what they will eat, importantly, as well. And that's often something that people are a bit more comfortable with. other supermarkets are available. They all have voucher schemes. There might be other ones that work for you, but that might be something to think about and explore. But I'm always happy to talk to anybody about university food banks and our experiences at staff, because we've tried everything over the years that we've been doing it. So always happy to talk.
That's terrific, Danny. Thank you. And given that you've just said that, we'll add some links for people to be able to do follow-ups as you wish, because I'm conscious that people might be dropping off as we get to time, because there are a lot of questions. I want to get through all of them. I'm just going to ask my team if they can just pop up, please. We have produced a resource for students around the cost of living crisis and what they can do and how to support them. So if one of you guys on my team can just pop that into the chat so that anybody who wants to can use that. It's a really practical guide for students around how to get through the next little while. The other thing I'm going to throw in is that many of you know that we bought the Scholarship Hub earlier in this year. We are very conscious that universities, for all of the amazing work, have limited financial capacity. What we are doing is we're going out to the market, to companies, to ask them to produce more scholarships, bursaries, grants, and funding for students. We want to be the biggest database of scholarships and bursaries, so that students, whether they're PhD, as Sketch, as you mentioned, postgraduate or undergraduates, are able to access funding from the corporates, who, let's be honest, all have a lot more money than all of us in the room. We'd like to encourage all universities to place all of their funds in the system as well, so that students only have to go to one place and find everything that is available to them. So please reach out if that's something that you're not currently doing with us and would like to. Matt from SHU making the point that there's a similar issue around hardship, around stigma. We've got to destigmatize, especially if this is going to be the next 12 to 18 months, which I think is reasonable to expect. Peter Sharp, Wellbeing Advisor, University of Chester, very important point from Jim, inadequate pre-registration information about cost of living. I would say, especially for international students, I fear we will see further increase of issues of non-affordability, lack of capacity for local rental accommodation as private sector decreases and demand from community house losses increase. We're seeing this already in Chester satellite campus areas, with many students having to live unfeasibly long distances away, which of course adds to the transportation costs. So there's no escaping that you're going to have to pay one way or the other. Thank you very much for the point, Peter. We are working on putting together some genuine cost of living stuff for each campus, certainly the campuses we're working with, based on data, so we can try and keep that as up to date as is possible and be helpful to all of you. Emma saying, I think we have the opportunity now more than ever to deal with stigma with the VUE promotion. Everyone is affected by the cost of living crisis. This is for everyone, which I could not agree with more. We've just bulk bought Aldi vouchers, the orange ones. Claire saying we've got £30 Tesco vouchers on offer, which is terrific. The problem sometimes with vouchers, we have multiple campuses, not the same supermarkets near each one, to try and prevent students having additional costs traveling to specific supermarkets. Thank you, Megan. I think that's a really important point for everyone to bear in mind. If there's no Tesco's nearby, a Tesco voucher isn't going to be as helpful as possible. Danny has added in his details, so there you go. Good news, Scholarship Hub. We often refer students to this in out appointments. Fantastic. And Emma is also busing students to Aldi, so there you go. Make it a field trip. So a lot of great advice there. A big focus on food is there, and rental. If there are any other points that people feel are important around not food or rental, please let us know. We want to try and be as broad as possible. Alison asking, could there be a Blackbullion learning pathway current cost of living advice? We direct our hardship applicants, and it would be good to have something current. Alison, we are working on that. And while there's requests, if there is something that you think that we can do, making zero promises, but we'd really like to know if there is something that you guys feel that we can be doing and we should be doing to support the community, please drop them into the chat, because we can then take them back. And if there's an overwhelming something, then we can put our resources into it and hopefully be able to continue to support you guys and your students as much as is possible. There's no other questions, so I guess what from Sketch, where does this go? Not asking you to call the end of the recession, because if you can do that, you and I should chat later about my stock portfolio. But where does this end? Is this the start of yet another new normal, where this is just the way things are going to be? Or do you think that it is possible to change the dynamic around student money as we go forward? So pop your crystal ball in front of you, and what are your thoughts, given how connected you are to kind of what's happening on the ground level, at a policy level, student level, and campus level?
I mean, I always say that you're an absolute mug to make political predictions in, especially with this government. But I think it has to be a crisis moment that brings about a sea change. I think it's actually, what we're seeing in the broader political sense is the Conservative government playing to some of the furthest right of their base, and therefore losing the centre and the left of the Conservative Party, which I think is an opportunity to build new cross-party consensus around things which are actually very, very reasonable asks, like maintenance grants, like the Welsh funding system. They're also actually like traditionally extremely conservative in the most traditional sense of the world, right? To support people while they go on and better themselves and prepare themselves for a career and better earnings. It's not always the argument that our full-time officers would make, but it's quite a reasonable policy ask, I think. And so I think it has to be a moment to rebuild a consensus of what's normal and the expectations on students. And I think the political environment is there for us to do it, in terms of the, that's kind of macro political level that I just spoke about, but also in terms of media sympathies and the position that students occupy in society. So how does it end? I mean, it's not going to end for a while, but I'm hopeful that when it does, it signals a change.